Hello and welcome to a midweek altered video. Thought that the season patch that came out earlier today would be a good way to get out some extra content, have a chat, and give my thoughts on the update that Equinox has provided that will impact the game pretty significantly moving forward. A lot of things to talk about. I'll give a spark notes of this introduction here on the article. Basically, they are of the opinion that the meta is built around three particular strategies. The common and rare core that Bravos decks are building upon, Sigismar and Trace from Ortis and Axiom in particular, and that narrows down what can be considered viable at the highest level of competition. Obviously, that doesn't impact me as a relatively stinky player of this game, but we're going to have to make changes to the decks anyway and hopefully learn from it, do better in the future. They also mentioned that the other factions, Izmir, Muna and Lyre, are all struggling to keep up, so they're going to reduce the power level of these three decks above and aim to limit them from exploding out of the gates. With that in mind, we'll get started. We'll read this part of the article as it's fairly significant towards what I play personally, I guess, my channel, so I'm going to talk about the things that interest me, but I'll talk about the whole thing anyway. Sigismar has been one of the top heroes since the game came out. Free stats every turn, reliable characters, and some mechanics in particular that rely on the number of characters you have in play and the types of characters that allow him to either pull ahead in expeditions early or maintain card advantage late that mean he needs to be clipped. The change is as follows. Basically, Sigismar doesn't get a token on the first day of the game. Feels like a small change, obviously, given a regular game will last 5, 6, 7 turns. One less token, not that big a deal, but it does change a lot of how he approaches his opening hands. And we'll get into that. So, Equinox says Sigismar will still be able to double advance on day 1. Not so sure about that, but it will require a larger investment, which have ripple effects throughout the game. Making early plays more meaningful, by which they mean they will cost the Sigismar player more resources in terms of cards, but also maintaining his signature style. That I agree with. So, Sigismar and Ortis in general have access to a sufficient number of stat-positive one-drop creatures, notably Ortis Trooper and Foundry Mechanic both give you more stats per expedition than they cost, and that opens up a lot of space to win expeditions 2 for 1 or even 2 for nothing on the opening turn, depending on the strength of your opponent's opening hand. And clipping the token on day 1 will impact that. So, given that he has stat positive creatures in the 1-drop space and stat neutral creatures in, say, Ortis Accountant, Ortis Attorney, that kind of thing, it is a reasonable expectation that Sigismar will still be able to advance and block on turn 1, but it becomes less of a blowout in the event that your opponent has the same amount of stats as you've both invested. So the example here would be if you play an Ortis Attorney out and a Ortis Trooper, that is 344 worth of stats, plus your recruit is 455, so clipping that means that opponents will be able to take a 1-for-1 more easily if they focus on one side, or they will force you to focus on one side as well. Still not that bad, but it does actually also impact something else that others might not, that might not be so readily apparent. A lot of players of Sigismar are running 2 and 3 drop characters in the unique slots that draw a card if you control a token or control a certain number of characters. That second section not as important on turn 1 and still available later in the game, but for example, there are a lot of Monolith Rune Scribes or similar costed characters running around that just have an arrow ability, draw a card if you control a token, and they won't be able to draw on turn 1 now unless you're potentially running a 2-drop version and you have a Aegis Templar in hand, for example. Putting stats on the board and replacing yourself on turn 1, pretty big deal. Obviously have access to less cards at that point in the game, so each card is more impactful. And that will most likely either slow down Sigismar or open up a space for people to be playing other uniques that are less explored at the moment. They do have a little kicker here as well, creating more space for card development to allow Baba Yaga to be unbanned or unsuspended in the future would be a big deal. So I've spoken about this before during games. I think it's pretty commonly accepted that the other 3, soon to be 4, Ortus heroes have largely died for Sigismar's sins, having access to the same cards in the pool and having to balance around what is best means that the things that are weaker just can't keep up. Like, there are not many situations where you'd want to play Waru or Zen over Sigismar unless you're really building towards an archetype or you've got uniques that suit that ability very closely. Gulrang's a little bit different. Plays as and gets built as a very different deck. But yeah, changes to other heroes would be welcome. Still, give Waru his token back, you cowards. Alright, on to Bravos. So 2 cards at once have been suspended here, the Tiny Djinn and the Haven Seringar. Pretty big deal. We'll come back to it, but let's just explore this first. So they've banned both rarities of each card, I think largely as a way to stop people from just swapping them around. If they just banned the most prevalent versions of the rare Tiny Djinn and the common Seringar, players would just swap them. Does impact how the decks would play, particularly because Tiny Djinn at rare is a lot cheaper. So investing 3 mana to ramp is a very different ask to spending 5 mana as a whole, but it doesn't really alleviate the issues. It would curb the most explosive starts out of Bravos in general. I think there are very few cards I would take over an opening Tiny Djinn and Haven Seringar on turn 1. Provides a lot of stats. It is extremely possible to double advance even if you can't block your opponent, and going 2 for 1 is still favourable for you, especially when you're going to be ramping ahead on the following turn. So this package is a secret card advantage engine, actually. Playing both out on turn 1 and then both out of reserve on turn 2. Really easy way to get a lot of stats on board, get ahead on mana, and also keep the cards that you draw from turn 2 in, not reserve because that's actually a thing, but in the vault for the following turns. You don't have to risk anything. Tiny Jin provides extremely efficient ramp into powerful late game strategies, often centered around the hunger. Interesting that they mentioned that there. And Serengar generates consistent card advantage while allowing Bravos decks to maintain strong expedition pressure. So if you're lucky and you move into a green only or green X expedition on turn 2, this card on its own can represent 2 advances, leaving you to boost up and challenge on the other side quite comfortably. I actually don't know if this is the card that I would have hit, because it has a lot of synergy with other pieces in the deck. So Arcolano Milks and Rages both cause you to add a lot of stats onto the board on the Serengar and draw your card turn early. But that's basically trading 1 for 1 because you don't get a second shot out of the Serengar. Has anti-synergy with Helping Hand, because if you want to play it out reserve, keep him around, you're not actually drawing your card until a turn later. So it does create a lot of interesting game choices in terms of the decks that you want to build, but I'm not going to complain that it's gone. However, at this point, I'd like to talk about the card that I probably would have hit instead of Serengar. So Tiny Jin, I'm 100% fine with. Banning that and then banning out the commons definitely makes sense. Serengar, common and rare, we've already spoken about that. They'd just swap them if it wasn't the case. But the card I actually think is closer to a ban than Serengar, or would warrant one, is actually Parliament of Ashes. Now, that, I don't know how hot a take that is, but that card creates a lot of feel-bad situations. The fact that at rare it actually replaces itself means it's always disadvantageous to remove it, because you're spending a card on removing a card and enabling more of yours when they've already recouped what they own or what they put into it. And it is possible there's a deck building cost there. It is a rare, so it takes up some of those slots. But the fact that it can render, I'm not going to say useless, but it can render a lot of your single target removal really inefficient, means that you often get a lot more value out of it. So in terms of gameplay experience, this is a more explosive start to the game for the opponents, but not having incidental permanent removal means that your single target removal would actually be a lot. It's going to cause you to lose expeditions where you could have challenged. So were it up to me, I probably would have banned Tiny Jin and Parliament of Ashes. I think Haven Serengar is okay to keep, because it's gonna take a cost to put into play. Axiom, Dr. Frankenstein, the Grems, and Reinstocking Station. Oof. So there are 2 notable traced builds at the moment. One of which is showing up a lot at top end competitions, the sort of mid-range card advantage slow burn one. Obviously there's the combo one that we've featured on the channel as well. Not as good, hell of a lot more fun to play, gotta say. And we'll go through it here. Definitely the least experience with this deck, but we've still had a read of it, definitely played a lot of things from the other side of the matchup, and let's go through it. Now, Trace has been one of the strongest heroes in competitive play, generating card advantage to delay its more impactful plays with low cost cards as part of the identity. but the combinations with Dr. Frankenstein and the Grems allowing Axiom decks to gain a lot of power from little investment. So that is part of the identity of Axiom in general. Low reserve costs, ways to either resupply or just put stuff into reserve is largely an Axiom identity. And the Grems putting pressure on permanents with 3 cost or less is true. However, I don't think that's as big an issue as the sacrificing a permanent to create a brass bug token. So the other aspect of Axiom's identity is being very landmark based, and it gets the overwhelming majority of ways to generate aerolith tokens as well. It's incidental to a lot of other factions, but the introduction of those is really what I think set the Grems over the edge. Dr. Frankenstein got a lot of extra targets out of Skybound Odyssey as well. So Restocking Station, there's also Aerolith Reef, the permanent that draws a card when it enters, and I think all of those have combined to create decks with very little way to actually stop them from playing and seeing a lot more cards than you throughout the game. Not disagreeing here, but I do disagree that the issue with the Grems is that it's cutting down on people's ability to play 3 cost permanents, and more to do with the fact that when played out of reserve with a way to actually recur it, and a lot of ways to both sacrifice this permanent and resupply at the same time is the issue. So 2 mana, 3/4/4 worth of stats, do it all again next turn, find another way to make an Aerolith token, and see an extra card over your opponent over multiple turns is largely the issue. Part of the identity of Altered is that you get an extra look at certain cards. You get punished for playing too much into reserve, so playing out of reserve is very important. And this is fine. Restocking Station going, not a big issue. It stops them from recurring their uniques. There are a lot out there that either at dusk or when it enters from reserve, you just ramp, and doing that over 3 or 4 turns is a massive deal, especially when they get to see more cards than you. So we're banning the rare Dr. Frankenstein. So the common version is 4/3 for 3/3 worth of stats, same ability. Notably, it is stat neutral out of reserve, which is a big deal. The common Grems, which has largely the same text as its rare version, but they want people to upgrade into that and both pay the cost of having to put rares in, and then the Restocking Station. So let's talk about the Grems in particular here. The rare version requires real deck building commitment, and let's talk about that quickly. So the difference is that the rare Grems obviously takes up 20% of your rare slots if you want to play 3 of them, and it discards permanents with hand cost 3 or less. So the fact that more people are going to have open slots from the Dr. Frankensteins and can put the Grems in there, I actually think this is a second order nerf to festival decks and Gulrang in particular, both of which are centric around 4 mana permanents, Messick Tet and Lyra Festival. But without the ability to recur those, it's not going to be able to shut them down. You still have to have the cards, that kind of thing. With these targeted changes, we aim to keep Trace's core playstyle intact while reducing its ability to gain too much power too quickly and repeat the same patterns every game. If they want to cut it down further, and I don't know if they do, might be worth looking at the card Pardew as a potential. A lot of decks running those, 2 mana for a 2/2/2, but it has a support ability that creates an Aerolith token. So with the current interaction on how permanents are cleaned up at the end step, sacrificing your Aeroliths allows you to put cards into reserve and have access to those cards on the following turn. But for Traced in particular, using the support ability while being stat neutral is a pretty big deal. So not only do they get to see another card, they get to add a scrap counter and move on. That's where I'd look if Traced starts to pull forward ahead of the other nerfed factions here. Celebration Day, rare and oof. Moyo Prison, popular deck on the BGA ladder. You hear a large amount of negative feedback around the experience of playing against this strategy. So this is not a power level ban, but a gameplay experience ban. Similar to, I would say, the reasons they gave for errating Robin Hood, the original change to the game. So that was both a power level and a gameplay experience ban, entirely justified. Super happy that card is largely unplayable now. Obviously these ones as suspended cards also unplayable. But this deck has been around since set 1. So Celebration Day came out in Beyond the Gates. Akesha and Taru was a really good user of the deck. So I'm interested to know what's different between the Moyo Prison one and Akesha and Taru, other than potentially the visibility and the popularity that it's had. Because I'm a level with you, man. That deck was miserable to play against. This is too, obviously they got more tools to slow the game down. Neelums and Rime Frosts out of Trial by Frost, a couple of other things as well. And people are just largely better. Big sad about this one. The 5 dedicated Waru players out there are, kicking the punch in the air right now. Never even got a chance to come back, but yeah, a little disappointing. Not something I necessarily played. Probably wish I had featured on the channel before this. Never really found a list that I thought was fun enough to show. I'm obviously not going to play a deck that I don't necessarily enjoy, but if someone had a list for me, would have played it. And then here we go, watch list updates. So things that are being looked at by Equinox for the next patch, which will be Roots of Corruption, I assume. Counting Sheep. So we've featured this one on the channel a lot. Fen and Rin Festival decks have been gaining popularity. Overall win rate is not especially high, but constant negative feedback about playing against them in their current iteration. I can confirm people have set off on me in the chat after playing a game. Actually had that one fella in the comments on the video that was upset. I don't see these as an issue as much as others would. Got surprised a couple of times, but once I knew it was a possibility, I think it just became a little bit more necessary to have some sort of answer to a permanent in your hand. Counting Sheep plus Festival is a big deal, especially the rare Lyra Festival list, because if you can anchor a character on the previous turn from reserve, say it's I don't know, you've got a Hatter in reserve or something like that, so you can keep a character around. You just need the Counting Sheep and the Lyra Festival in hand, 6 mana. Even cheaper if you've got reducers in hand. These are very streamlined but very telegraphed decks as far as I'm concerned, so my answer to it has always been to either keep some form of cheap removal you can delay to clip them if they play it early, or conditionless removal for permanence in whatever faction you're playing as you head into the late game if you are suspicious of it. They can't generally compete in expeditions consistently. They do have to sort of play towards it. So, you know, there are situations where they just don't advance at all, and I think that's the risk that they run. Out of faction Ouroboros. This was also featured in a lot of trace lists. Definitely the linchpin of the deck that we ran for Traced not too long ago. Go check out that video. And it is a big deal. So resupplying has become easier than ever. With the introduction, again, of area list tokens, Axiom lists have a really easy way to see many cards, and what the Ouroboros does is it lets you filter through your deck very quickly. Getting this out on turn 1 and resupplying activating the abilities of a permanent can actually get you to 5 scrap counters on turn 1, theoretically, if you're extremely lucky. Much more reasonable that it comes through on turns 3 or 4, but obviously you've invested into a 3-mana permanent on turn 1. So if your opponent's ahead, they may get a 2 for nothing, but you've developed and you know that you're going to have more cards in the future. Not a bad one to look at. I think it takes some form of deck building cost. Not only do you have to play the 3 Ouroboroses, obviously it does replace itself with the reserve card straight away. You can reduce the cost with Foundry Mechanics and Engineers, but also you have to find ways to activate it for cheap. Resupply is not a hard thing to find. Asarian Pebble obviously gets one every second turn. Like I said, you can just activate the permanents. Mechanical Training is, I think, an all-star in those lists, and potentially also another card to look at, purely because it is copies 4, 5, and 6 of a lot of your permanents. So, mentioned them before, but Aerolith Reef gives you 3 extra copies of a removal spell, putting extra counters on the Keylon cylinders, that kind of thing is a big deal, and obviously just a 1-mana resupply. It's bloody huge. And Brassbug Hives, making 3 points worth of stats for 1 mana, and then another 3 points for 2 mana. Generally blows the back out of a game. They're also looking at multi-anchoring uniques. Some unique cards are able to anchor several characters on the same day. These cards are among the most powerful uniques in Altered and have generated a large amount of negative feedback. Again, poor gameplay experience, understandable. Games can quickly feel unwinnable. Their impact is partly limited by the high play rate of Sigismar and Bravos using the Hunger. So Sigismar has access to a lot of single target removal, so bouncing the unit in question is possible. These uniques tend to show up exclusively in Lyra and Muna, but they tend to show up in the Muna list specifically. The Hunger answers it very cleanly. Obviously, they just play everything out, but you have to play that early. It is an 8-mana investment in order to do that at rare. And Sigismar can be played around as well if they're playing copies of the Spindle or Parliament of Ashes in the case of Lyra lists. So toughness makes it a lot harder to deal with, because obviously you're putting extra mana into what they've likely paid 2 or 3 for, and they'll still get some value out of it that way. But yes, with the changes made to the strong decks, these are likely going to see an uptick in playability, so we'll have to see how that goes. I have no issue with that. What about the Hunger? It plays an important role in the overall balance of the game. It keeps certain strategies in check and gives slower decks a way to compete. With the suspension of Tiny Djinn, it'll come at a much higher cost. So that is true. Decks are largely losing 3 very efficient slots of ramp. We may see more people cut back into the other forms of ramp in Bravos. The ones I am thinking of are Colourful Cuckoos, Mighty Djinns, Swift Djinns. Those are the ones that are seeing play in each hero for one reason or another. Basira likes Cuckoo, Kojo likes Mighty Djinn because it lets them recoup a card, and Atsadi obviously likes Swift Djinn because it is a 3-mana way to draw a card on turn 1 and ramp yourself. So they may jump into those. Mighty Simbi is also an option, I believe, if I remember the text on that card, but I don't think anyone's diving that far into the bag. No action. I assume this means it's on the watch list, but it might not even be. Okay, so the rules update. We've touched on it before. Obviously, it's the whole reason the Ouroboros is on the watch list, and the prison style decks, which we've also touched on. Moyo and Akesha are the 2 heroes most likely to sort through their whole deck with the prison style ones, and then traced with the Hyperloop. Sierra also gets a bit of value out of that, but it's not as good. Any time during morning, a player whose deck is empty may reshuffle their discard pile into their deck. Before, after, or in between drawing their first and second card, which would be considered simultaneous. This change prevents players from reshuffling their deck multiple times during the day. At the same time, has little impact. So, this is changing how those decks will loot through their discard pile multiple times a turn. So for example, if you have 5 cards in discard in the morning, you can shuffle them back in, draw through the 5. The way it would have worked previously is that any cards you discarded, say like a Celebration Day, you could have just played that one, drawn a card, put it back in hand for next turn, which is how the prison decks will imprison you in the game. And obviously with the Ouroboros, you're discarding one of the cards anyway, so you get to sculpt exactly what it is you want in your deck at any given time. So not being able to do that is a big change, but I don't think it's that many games on average. Maybe somewhere in the realms of 5 or 10%, given how common those decks are in the meta. Foundry Axiom Bastion is reverting to an earlier ruling as well. Activate the R ability of a character multiple times. No, but you can activate the R abilities of a different character on a different turn. So you can't tap 2 Foundries to give something its reserve abilities twice, but 2 characters on the same day are fair game. Della and Bolt, we use the original version of the ruling. Let's look that card up. Della and Bolt. Okay, sweet. We're not doing that. I'll just cut that out. And then patch notes philosophy. Spark notes of this is that they will not be balancing for singleton and no unique formats. The priority will be for the competitive formats to be as balanced as possible, and as such, if they need to ban anything egregious out of those formats, I assume they will, but it will likely come in the ban list, and the suspension list will likely follow what is available in standard for the time being. Finally, rotation and an eternal format. So this was functionally guaranteed to happen, very closely expected at the very least. That set rotation was inevitable, because not introducing it basically creates a situation where, in order to keep new cards entering the playable card pool, you either have to ban old cards or power creep the game. So if a new set comes out and all of the cards are explicitly worse than cards in an older set, you don't really have an incentive to buy the new set or look at cards or deck build with it or anything like that. And as such, Equinox will be following Roots of Corruption. The set after Roots of Corruption, sorry. The first 3 sets will be banned out of what is standard. So any cards printed in those sets will have to move to what is an eternal format. Time to set that one up, but you will have access to the cards that you've purchased at any given time. Interested about that. The more I will be more interested if I know that they are planning on supporting it in a competitive fashion. It does say that it'll be integrated, but I'm curious to know if that is in a side event or its own Worlds bracket. Obviously coming from Magic the Gathering, Vintage, Legacy, Modern, Pauper, I guess, are all eternal formats. So we are used to that, but depending on how supported that is, I don't know how the player base will react. Will people stay on an eternal format? Will they ignore it in order to play standard? Does it fracture the community even further than it already has in terms of singleton and no uniques? I don't think these impacted your ability to find a game all that much, but I think people will specialize in either standard or eternal, and I assume that will determine the amount of support for each moving forward. Standard will likely be the focus, perhaps with this being a partial set. They may follow a different ban list eventually, but I doubt it moving forward. The Phileas Fog change is funny. You may pass if you do the next permanent you play this afternoon. Costs 2 less to play. Definitely not possible. So that makes a lot of sense. And that's it. We're all done. That's my thoughts. It was a lot of rambling. I apologise. This is the first time I've ever done one of these. But yeah, looking forward to see how it pans out. If you have any thoughts or disagreements with me, drop them in the comments. I'll sort you out, or I will change my worldview as is needed. But yeah. See you in the next video. We're going to be back to gameplay soon. Take it easy. Love your work.